Joining us now is NBC's Julia Ainsley, who is outside the courthouse in Washington, D.C. Former Republican Congressman of Florida, David Jolly, an MSNBC political analyst, joins us, along with Jonathan Capehart, MSNBC host, associate editor of The Washington Post, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Julia, what are the arguments being made in court at this hour?
Well, they just started. It got underway inside Judge Nichols' courtroom. And Chris, there are two hearings or two cases rather, that are being heard in one hearing. In one case, the plaintiffs have argued that the migrants who are being held in Guantanamo need access to legal counsel. In another, they're arguing that they need a temporary restraining order to block Trump from transferring any more migrants to Guantanamo Bay. And in fact, the plaintiffs are representing in this case, they've been told there's at least a pause on transfers until Monday. The reason they're arguing this, Chris, is because we've seen Guantanamo be emptied out before. Just a few weeks ago, there were 178 Venezuelan men. They were all either deported or transferred back to the United States. They've emptied it out again. They continue to empty out Guantanamo for many reasons. One, because of the legal challenge that's happening behind me, but also because of the expense and the fact that it's not up to the code that it needs to be in order to comply with longstanding federal court settlements that say that ICE detention has to meet certain standards. And it's incredibly expensive to get it up to that standards. Even with the tents that they've built, we've told they've had a lot of problems. And the existing Migrant Operations Center isn't equipped to hold more than 50 people, and even those not in great condition. So they continue to use it, then empty it out again. But it matters, Chris, because if Trump does decide to use this further, and he might, if he invokes something called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, if he decides to use that, he could have broad sweeping powers to use the Department of Defense resources, which includes the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. So there could be another world in which Guantanamo gets used very much more robustly to hold more people than it is right now. And so that's why these lawyers want the judge to rule on it.
All right. Thanks so much. We appreciate you, Julia. I know you want to get back into court. Jonathan, does this help Trump politically? Is that what's going on here?
Politically, in the sense that, you know, a lot of people who voted for him, and quite honestly, a lot of people around the country want something done about migrants coming over the border without papers. Do something about undocumented migration. But as I was listening to Julie's report, and especially her pointing out the expense of holding migrants at Guantanamo, and leave aside the symbolism of Guantanamo, that money could be better spent hiring more immigration judges, hiring more personnel who would make it possible for the United States government to cycle through all the backlog of cases of people who have been trying to get into the country legally, especially through the asylum system. But instead, the Trump administration, and the president in particular, isn't using the money that way. He's using the money in this way, which is very dramatic, very theatrical, but does nothing about solving the problem.
So let's talk a little bit more, Congressman, about the money. The Wall Street Journal has this new reporting on the mounting costs and logistical issues. And I think, obviously Julia touched on those. But let me give you just one number. Holding someone at Guantanamo Bay costs $16,540 a day per prisoner by one estimate, not including legal fees. At some point beyond his base, does this start to not make sense to people? And Jonathan points this out. I mean, there are a lot of people who wanted our border to be secured, but does it start to not make sense?
Well, I think for part of his base, the cruelty is the point. The imagery of Guantanamo Bay and undocumented immigrants is something that probably excites the base, unfortunately. I think it's a reflection of a rather dark heart. But well, Chris, I have been to Guantanamo Bay and toured it extensively. I haven't been there as a detainee, as an observer. And I can tell you nothing about this makes sense whatsoever for federal policy. It is remarkably expensive, as you just pointed out. It is an inefficient use of, or administration, if you will, of the justice system and our immigration system. The conditions are not what they need to be. You see that in the court filings as well, and particularly when it comes to access to legal representation. But I think what Donald Trump has shown us in his first 50-plus days is he doesn't care about any of that. I mean, the darkest themes of Donald Trump's campaign were around immigration, his willingness to make immigrants a target of his policies. He is not trying to attack legal immigration or just illegal immigration. He is anti-immigrant. Donald Trump is anti-immigrant. And so for him, it's almost as though he sees immigrants as a permanent underclass. And if the treatment at Guantanamo is less than what they deserve, so be it for Donald Trump. I think this is an area where the courts have some hard decisions to make. I suspect some of the courts in the process will indeed continue to stop Donald Trump. Ultimately, does this end up the Supreme Court? It very well might, because I think Donald Trump wants the imagery of undocumented immigrants at Guantanamo, and I think many in his base would cheer that on.
And the opponents of Gitmo obviously believe they have a strong case, Jonathan. I want to read part of what the original statement was from the ACLU when they decided to file. The administration is sending people to an offshore brutal prison without any legal authority or legitimate policy rationale. Put simply, this is about photo ops and theatrics. I wonder, though, does this resonate, honestly, beyond his base? There is so much going on. This whole strategy of if you throw enough stuff out there, they won't be able to keep up with it. Does it work in this instance?
Well, I would say it works in this instance because this is one of the big issues that animated the presidential campaign. But again, to the point of the story that you were just reading, and to jump off of what David was talking about, this is all theatrics. One of the other stories that's been out there that maybe hasn't gotten enough attention is the fact that ICE arrests have been lower than what President Trump has wanted, and he's extremely frustrated by that. Why? Because he's not getting the pictures and more of the drama and the theatrics that he wants in order to show his base and others that he's doing something. And again, I come back to the comprehensive immigration bill, full immigration overhaul that should have been voted on, should have passed, that would have given money to actually solve the problem of immigration in the country. Secure the border, get enough, hire enough immigration judges and other personnel that would make it possible to get through the backlog of cases that makes undocumented immigration such a problem for this country. But Republicans didn't want to do it, and certainly President Trump doesn't want to do it because of what David said at the beginning of his first answer. The cruelty is the point.
And David, these financial and logistical consequences are kind of indicative of what's become a larger issue for the Trump administration and specifically DOJ. For example, the AP is now reporting that DOJ's plan to close nearly 800 federal offices could save roughly $500 million. But that hasn't been verified. That's their number. It doesn't take into account expenses like the cost of the closures, moving spaces. It doesn't take into account if they have to get a lease on another space. What does this say about the decision-making process unfolding in the White House?
It is. Look, the level of professional ignorance when it comes to the federal budget between Donald Trump and Elon Musk is really at historic levels. Nothing they are doing will come close to balancing the budget or right-sizing the government. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And so you're talking about they are playing with about 10% of the federal budget right now that they're trying to make cuts on. And let's say they're cutting half of that. Still a big number in raw terms. But you're also not worried then about, OK, what happens when we have to replace those services? Or as you said, if we dispose of owned properties, we have to lease properties. You know, what a lot of Democrats on the Hill keep saying, and I'm not sure it has yet broken through, is watch out, because what they're really coming for next, if they're serious about cutting the federal government, is the earned benefits programs, what are sometimes called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt. There's nothing they can do about. That's 70% of the budget, roughly, those four things. And so I don't know where the victory lap finally comes down for Donald Trump and Elon Musk, because nothing that they're doing is ultimately going to right-size the federal budget unless they have the political wherewithal to go after the big ticket items. And what they've all suggested is they're not willing to do that, which I suppose is good for Americans, that those programs may be saved. But let's see if they actually mean that and they keep their word.